So I think we will get started, and I'm delighted that everyone is here with us today. My name is Naomi Yavna Close, and I'm the Reverend Emmett M. Benvenu, SJ, Distinguished Chair of Humanities and Professor of Languages and Cultures at Loyola University, New Orleans. As a member of the Conference Steering Committee, I'm really delighted to thank our speakers for their powerful presentations earlier, and thank you all for returning for this live question answer period, which will be moderated by Jennifer Willard of Georgetown University. Just to remind you, our speakers are Genevieve Negron Gonzalez, who's Associate Professor of Leadership Studies at the University of San Francisco, Jose Arnulfo Cabrera, who's Director of Education and Advocacy for Migration with the Ignatian Solidarity Network, Joan Rosenhauer, who's Executive Director of the Jesuit Refugee Services USA, and finally, Joanna Williams, Executive Director of the Kino Border Institute. At the conclusion of the question and answer, we will have an examen led by Chris Kerr, who's the Director of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. So I think this panel is pretty much a who's who in immigration Jesuit work. So I'm very honored to be able to introduce you all. Before opening up this discussion, Andrea invited me to just share my perspective, which is, as I said, is really an honor. This panel is very meaningful for me, not just because I teach at a Jesuit university, but because I'm the granddaughter of 4 immigrants, all of whom came to the United States to escape persecution and oppression. And each of them instilled in me the importance of radical hospitality. Just to highlight one of them, with apologies to the other 3, my grandma Anne came to this country about 100 years ago, speaking no English. And because New York City offered free education for immigrant women, she graduated from Hunter College with a degree in math and physics. So I don't know how many of you got help on your calculus homework in high school from your grandmother, but that was my immigrant grandma. So beyond that, I think about grandma and my other grandparents when my students and I collaborate with the advocacy work of the Jesuit Social Research Institute on my campus, Loyola New Orleans, which has as one of its most high priorities immigration advocacy and work. We also do volunteer work, both my students and I, and also in my personal life, in our immigrant and refugee community in New Orleans. My own research doesn't focus on contemporary refugees, but actually on Anne Frank and the lessons from the Holocaust for today. And so when Joan Rosenhauer was talking about child refugees, I was really thinking about Anne Frank, who would have been 92 on Saturday. Most people think of her as this little Dutch girl, but in fact, she and her family were refugees, right? They were refugees from Germany. And 10 years ago, volunteers in the YIVO, the Yiddish Research Institute in New York, found a letter from a man begging for asylum for his children. It was written in 1942. And this letter is literally almost identical to 60,000 other letters in that archive, all of which were turned down, right? These are all people who were not allowed to immigrate, except that this letter was written by Otto Frank, the father of Anne Frank. And so I really like to remind my students that, right, what Anne's diary does is remind us of that innate human dignity in the 80 million other displaced people, right? I think that was the number that we heard in the presentations today, that 26 million refugees and 80 million displaced people. And so, you know, maybe my students are shocked, right, that nobody helped Anne Frank, but we have this moment every day. We can advocate for, we can support, we can work on behalf of, we can be in solidarity with people just like her and just like us. So personally, I want to thank you for the great work that you're doing, and turn this over to our moderator, Jennifer Willard. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and thank you for connecting the personal and the professional and the political and referencing your own history and genealogy as we connect today. Let me add my welcome to each of you this afternoon for us to have hopefully an open and energetic discussion based on the panel that you all watched a little bit before this or earlier today. I want to thank each of our panelists for describing their work and joining us, and thank Genevieve for her moderation of the panel that we recorded. I do want to say that we recorded that panel a couple of weeks ago, you could probably tell. And so the first thing that I want to do is take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question and inquire of each of our panelists if they have anything that they'd like to update us on. We know that immigration policy and conditions on the ground change quickly. And so let's hear from each of you. I'll call on each of you if there's anything you'd like to update or catch us up on from the time that we recorded the panels. So Jose, let me start with you.
At the current moment, there has not been any new movement with any of the different legislations that would grant or give a creative pathway to citizenship for undocumented students, their families, and their parents.
Great, thank you. Joan, how about you? Anything to update?
Well, I guess I would just say that I think the process of the first phase of allowing people who had been kept in Mexico through MPP into the United States is well on its way. And so many, maybe most of them have been allowed into the United States to pursue their asylum claim. And then there's a phase two that are more complicated cases. And so that's kind of the next big thing. And then there have been more exceptions obviously coming in, exceptions to Title 42, which was the public health ruling that closed our border, basically shut down asylum. And then the one other thing is that I just saw something about some movement on the part of the Attorney General to vacate some rulings that had suggested that victims of domestic abuse would not be eligible. And so that has just, I think today, come out that is being shifted. And that was something Jeff Sessions had established and has now been overruled by Merrick Garland. So those are some important changes, I think.
Absolutely, thanks. And Joanna, I know in your recorded talk, you even indicated there might be some updates a few weeks from that time that you could share with us. So anything that you can contribute or catch us up on since that time a few weeks?
Sure. Well, Joan stole my most hot off of the presses news. But I was also reading about the domestic violence ruling just right before I signed on. And I think that's huge because we have so many asylum seekers who are fleeing because of domestic violence. I think of a Guatemalan woman that just arrived here a couple of weeks ago who was fleeing her husband, and our attorneys had told her, you know, you just don't have a very strong asylum case under current law. And now that's being transformed. And so there's different opportunities. It's, you know, there's the headline, but then there's those individuals that it'll affect. But I teased a lot of updates in my presentation because there was a lot that I couldn't say about the Title 42 exceptions process, which Joan referenced. Essentially, at the time that we recorded, we were getting a few people through under the auspices of a lawsuit that the ACLU had filed against the US government. But since that point, what's known as the consortium process has gone live in Nogales, which is a collaboration between the International Rescue Committee, Kino Border Initiative, Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project, and Justice for Our Neighbors, in order to identify a much larger number of individuals for exceptions. So we're now seeing 30 people processed a day, 30 asylum seekers processed a day through the port of entry here in Nogales. And that started about 2 weeks ago, and then we went public on Friday. If you haven't seen our press release, you can check out our website and our press release for more information. So I mentioned Elena in my presentation, and Elena has now been processed into the US and is now in the community trying to settle in with her son and still tuning into our Save Asylum events and meetings via Zoom. So now she's, rather than being here in Nogales, she's continuing to support the movement. And we actually quote her at the end of our press release. So you can check out her quote about that, and happy to answer other questions about the Title 42 exceptions. But this process, at least the consortium process, is likely to go through the end of July. That's what IRC has agreed to, is to July 31st. So we continue to push for what's the plan next, because we don't want this interim process is not adequate. It's still not a full restoration of the right to asylum. So we continue to push for the end to Title 42 and for access to asylum at the ports. And I invite all of you to continue to push for that.
Great, thank you so much. And let me just encourage folks, as you've seen from Naomi and others in the chat, to open the chat window if you haven't already, and place your questions and comments in there. We have a couple of folks monitoring, and so I'm going to hope to be able to get to them as best I can. And with great timing and a segue, Joanna, you talking about Title 42, and Joan as well, there is a question in the chat that says, I noted the mention of Title 42 in the panel presentation. What would advocacy to eliminate that directive look like? Maybe Joanna, we could start with you, and then Joan or Jose or Genevieve, if you want to chime in.
Sure, so Title 42 is in an executive order. It's actually through CDC is technically where it originates, but basically it's forcing people to go back to Mexico, be immediately expelled, and eliminating access to due process. So technically, it's really the executive branch that has the power to change that. So I think some of our advocacy efforts could be directed at the executive branch. So writing letters, for example, UNHCR made a pretty damning statement about Title 42 a couple of weeks ago, and we think that that's been helpful to move the needle on the political calculus. So any kind of advocacy that's directed at the administration is helpful. I would say more at a grassroots level, that even though that Congress doesn't have direct power over Title 42, part of the calculation that Biden's making is a political calculation of, does he have the political cover to eliminate this order? So actually congressional advocacy is enormously helpful, especially if you have a moderate senator or moderate representative in your district or your state, to push those individuals to request that the administration get rid of Title 42 is going to change the political landscape and provide Biden the cover that he thinks that he needs, which we disagree whether or not he needs that, but at least give him the cover that he thinks that he needs in order to eliminate that order.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, and I think I agree with everything Joanna said, and I don't need to repeat that. And I certainly have heard that the administration is very concerned in general. I mean, it's part of the reason that this is all going more slowly than we might have hoped, that there will be, you know, the kind of PR challenge that they might face if there's like massive numbers of people coming across the border, if they remove restrictions too quickly. And they're trying to prepare for that before they get in that situation. So I think political cover is critical, and they have to know that there's an audience, that there's a voting audience that supports these changes. But the one thing I wanted to say is that I also think that there's a challenge in that it seems reasonable that in a time of a pandemic that we would have the need or the right to, you know, stop people from coming in order to protect the public health of the United States. That doesn't sound like an unreasonable point of view. And so I think we have to get a couple of key messages across in order to get people to the point where they will advocate. And I think one of them is the clear messages from public health leaders and experts who have said that we can protect public health and still allow people the right to asylum in the United States. So we have to kind of pull out that argument that that's the only way to protect public health. The other thing that I think we have to do, and it kind of ties into the conversation we were hearing earlier, or the story and the reference to Anne Frank and stuff. One of the things that I always raise up is the story of the St. Louis, and the fact that that was the boat that had many refugees from Jewish people from Germany fleeing the Nazis, came to the United States, were turned away, sent back to Europe. Hundreds of them were killed by the Nazis in Europe. And part of the US adherence to the asylum system was our response to that, and said we would never be that kind of country. we would not be the kind of people who refuse to give protection to people who are fleeing for their lives. And that's precisely what we're doing here. So we have to remind people what this decision is. We can protect public health and still give people who are fleeing for their lives a place of refuge in the United States. And so that is the argument for people to, do everything they can to advocate against Title, or for the removal of Title 42.
I really appreciate the framing that both Joanna and Joan have shared. I think the one other thing that I would add additionally is that, Biden was elected in significant part because progressive forces were willing to take the leap of faith and rally behind him and his promises to a more humanitarian immigration policy. If there was something that was very clear from the Trump years, it was that on the question of immigration, we had swung so far towards just a complete disregard for the humanity of migrants. And Biden campaigned and won on a platform saying that he was going to change that. And I think that immigration policy is a vast and complicated web of policies and rules and laws, and the distinction between sort of the state and the federal and all of that. The repeal of Title 42 is actually a very straightforward and doable question that would allow us to make great strides on the question of humanitarian relief and the beginning of the process of a basic restoration of human rights towards migrants. And I think that we also need to be able to stand on the promises that were made that gave Biden the leg up in the election and in the presidency and in this process. I think holding him and all of our elected officials to account for that kind of promise is a really, really important task of this moment.
Great. Thank you for that question, and thanks for those responses and that information and that framing in response to the frame of that question of where we might be. Another question in the chat, is there any move to bring the immigration courts and judges under the judicial system and not the Department of Justice? I don't know if that's within anyone's bailiwick, if they want to respond to that.
I mean, I guess I could say a word about it, which is it's something that we think would be a great idea. It's something that a lot of groups have proposed. I don't think that there's actually any movement in that change is anywhere close to imminent.
No, I was just going to say, I haven't seen anything to suggest that that's actually in the works. So
it would be a pretty, oh, I'm sorry.
I would just say, I agree there hasn't been any movement. And I think that that's something that's always striking to people, to understand how our immigration court is actually under the DOJ. And that was one of the ways the Trump administration used to really roll back a lot of immigration process. One of the very first things at the time when I was a community organizer in Cincinnati is the rolling back of priorities for deportations. And so right in the beginning, and since the Trump administration, that's why we saw so many mothers and fathers who the only thing that they ever did wrong was have a broken taillight, and now they were facing deportation. And because of policies and how the Trump administration and the DOJ and the different attorney generals through the Trump presidencies that were there, they were able to manipulate the courts to change so much of our immigration process, and has hurted immigrants' families so much.
Yes, indeed. And I guess I would just add to that a little bit as well, that while it would be such a truly, I think, substantial change, not that I'm arguing against it, I think it would be good to move the courts into the judicial branch. I think there are still plenty of opportunities, Jose, as you were suggesting, and beyond that, to make changes even within the current structure that would be quite beneficial in terms of who is appointed to serve as judges under several of the attorneys general, discretion was pulled away from judges in many ways administratively that could be returned to allow flexibility for responding to different circumstances. And also within the legislative branch in terms of thinking about the expansion of the use of criminal charges, not even convictions, but criminal charges as predicates for removal is something that could happen there as well. So I think there is a lot of room still for rolling back some of the changes that were made in the past 4 years that could open up some space within even the processing that occurs in the current structure of immigration judges being in the executive branch that could be positive. So I just wanted to add that there. Thank you. Another question here. From the viewpoint of each of you as panelists, this question writer asks, how does the immigration work of ISN and the missions of the Keno Border Initiative and JRS USA relate to the mission of Jesuit higher education? So in light of mission, how are institutions called to respond to the current immigration realities that we are facing now? A somewhat large question, but certainly appropriate and compelling. If any of you want to chime in, or I can go across. So if you have a response, please chime in. We can make our way around the panel.
I can. I know everybody has answers to this and ways that we can be involved. I think, first of all, from our perspective, higher education can play a significant role in collaborating in our efforts to respond to the refugee crisis around the world. There are ways that, we've partnered with colleges and universities on research projects that really help us advance our work and strengthen and make it more sophisticated. We've had interns that have worked with us, and that's a great opportunity. That this past year, we had one intern who helped us organize our mental health and psychosocial support community of practice around the world, and would set up webinars and bring that group together. So this is important substantive work that, we have limited staff, and to have interns helping with that. Another intern did the initial research and writing for the global JRS statement on vaccine equity that we issued in February, I believe it was, early February. So, there are roles like that. There are things that students can be involved in on campuses. We have something called a JRS action team that helps because I think part of the challenge that we've certainly seen in recent years, and that we need to overcome now, as there's perhaps some opening to change the narrative about migrants and refugees, and to focus people more on how they contribute wherever they are around the world, and the importance of being open and welcoming to them. So those stories have to be told. People have to understand they're human beings, their mothers, fathers, they contribute wherever they go. They're incredibly resilient people, just very impressive people and things. So for students to get involved in telling the story, having the experience, we have a simulation. We're going to have a miles for refugees that different groups can walk or ride or run or whatever. This year, I think it's 41 miles for over 30 days leading up to our 41st anniversary. So there's an advocacy. There are so many advocacy. This is a moment for advocacy that goes way beyond. I mean, I mentioned vaccine equity as a critical, kind of a moral challenge of our day that impacts, refugees are at the back of the line of the countries at the back of the line when it comes to vaccines. And if we don't make sure that non-citizens are included in all of the plans, they will be the ones who will suffer the most. And we know what the suffering from the pandemic means. It is a life and death situation. So lots of advocacy issues that you'll hear about Title 42 and all of the work at the border and all of the possibilities of, responding to dreamers and just much advocacy that can be done on college campuses. So I could go on for a long time. I don't want to take over everything. So let me turn it over to my co-panelists to share their stories. But there are lots of ways for higher education to work with us, and we would love to do more to work with you.
As I shared in my presentation, one of the things that ISN we do a lot is we work with college students and students who are presidents of college clubs who are doing migration advocacy on their campuses. Actually, this week, and as we're speaking right now, we are currently in our Migration Justice Summit for student organizers. And I think the last hour, we had one of Joanna's colleagues, Tracy, talking to students and doing education on organizing on their college campus. What our program, what we hope to do is allow the students to find ways on what does a more just world, more just campus, how does a welcoming campus look like on their schools? And these are students, in many cases, who are directly impacted, who are DACA recipients, who might be undocumented themselves, have family members who have TPS or are undocumented, and some whose parents have been deported. These students are working to think of what will make their campus a more welcoming school. And I think the biggest thing is to listen to them. You know, the UAPs calls us to walk with the youth, to have moments of encounter with those who are at the margins. And my time at working at ISN and also being at Xavier, a student, I've learned that in the Jesuits, they always like to remind us that we encounter God through the stories of those who are the most vulnerable. And having those moments, having those moments of encounters with our students, but also listening to the students, listening to student organizers who are working towards making a campus. And sometimes a lot of you might think these are very radical ideas. These are ideas that will will challenge us. These are ideas that will make our Board of Trustees very uncomfortable with the idea of welcoming undocumented students, supporting undocumented families. And those ideas, while they're so radical, that's part of our mission. It's part of what it means to be a Jesuit institution. It means to be a Jesuit school. And yesterday was the 9th year anniversary of the executive order on DACA. This upcoming Friday will be the 1st year anniversary of the Supreme Court ruling in favor of the DACA program, something that even to this day, I have still been baffled because we all, especially at ISN, prepared for a negative ruling and but when it came positive, it was very surprising. And students are continuing to organize and continuing to find ways to support and to get their classmates to advocate. We actually right now have an action alert going on in ISN asking their senators to support legislation that would give a pathway to citizenship. And the last thing that I wanna say, and then I'll pass it on, is that, this past February, I was able to adjust my status. And since then, I was a DACA recipient. And before that, I was undocumented. In the Jesuit world, in this higher ed world, we always love to talk about DACA, and we love to advocate because it's something that's so easy. And I think even in the immigration conversations, DACA or Dreamers, they're kind of this big fish in a small little pond, and they take up a lot of space. I want to encourage a lot of us to, when we think about advocating for citizenship, advocating for a just world, we mustn't forget undocumented immigrants, asylum seekers, TPS holders, because in order, if we want to ensure that all of our students are safe, that we're supporting them, we have to remember to advocate for the whole family. And as Catholics, we value family. We fight for the unity of family. And if we only fight for DACA recipients to get pathway to citizenship, they will have their citizenship while they say goodbye to their parents who would be deported because we couldn't fight for them.
So you have a long list of things to do from Joan and Jose, so I might not add to the action alert list, but what I would say, maybe on a more personal note, I remember when I was a high school senior and I walked onto Georgetown University's campus and I was in the middle of classic college visits and have toured a bunch of campuses. And Georgetown was actually the only Jesuit university that I had visited. I wasn't familiar with the Jesuits at the time, but I had this sense as I walked onto campus and as I went through the tour, I thought this university is about something more than me just going on and being successful in life. And I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but I think that was the Jesuit character of Georgetown. It's also the Jesuit character of all these other universities I've had the privilege to get to know in the past several years. And that's the great strength that we have, but it's also the great challenge that we have of, are we fundamentally as campuses able to live up to that? We don't exist just to get people good paychecks as they graduate. We exist to grow them in a faith that does justice, and we exist to promote. AMDG is such a tagline that Jesuits sign off with. But what would it really look like if we were working towards the greater glory of God on campus? And I think in some ways, the role, how this intersects with the work of KBI, is that we see ourselves as an institution to needle or encourage or give life to other institutions to remind universities of that mission. That in the midst of the many demands and the complicated fiscal situation that many universities are in right now, how can we still take risks in order to work towards the kingdom, in order to promote the greater glory of God, and especially to communicate to students to think outside the realm of what's normal when we're thinking about careers and professional development and all of that. That it's in part because of my Georgetown education that I somehow stumbled along this path that led me to becoming the executive director at the Keno Border Initiative. But that's not the kind of career that's usually advertised in college career fairs, and that's really the strength of the career center. So how are we expanding the range of what looks like normal, and how are we setting people up for careers that do justice in the world, instead of just paying lip service to the taglines? And I think that's really the opportunity of this partnership between our institutions, JRS, KBI, ISN, and universities, is that it allows us to challenge each other to a higher mission. And it's something that I would encourage campuses to reflect on. This is the whole point of this conference, is reflect on how is that echoed in the different levels of leadership and in the institutional decisions that are being made on campus.
Yes, that notion of formation and thinking about this together. Thanks to each of you. Genevieve, I don't know if you had any comments or thoughts that you wanted to add. I wanted to point out in the chat that we've dropped a link to your recent volume for folks to take a look at, but anything else you wanted to add?
I think that my co-panelists did a fantastic job. I know we have many other questions in the chat, so I'm happy to, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that it is absolutely our responsibility to answer this call. And there are multiple ways to do it. There are no shortage of ideas, and we just need to step up to the plate.
Great, thank you so much. Another question, so I'll paging through the great comments and resources that are in the chat. Thank you to Andrea, Naomi, and others for putting those up as we're talking. A question about the issue of children separated from parents and caregivers at the border. Someone's asking if any of you could comment on any work that your own organizations are doing related to reunification, and your sense of if the government is capable of reuniting those families that remain separated at the moment. Would anyone like to respond to that?
So from the KBI angle, I can say two things. We're not as involved in what is being more traditionally characterized or considered in the Family Reunification Task Force that Michelle Bernet is heading up, which is that time when parents were taken away from their kids at the time that they were crossing the border. We are involved in a couple of other dimensions of this work. So the important thing with that question is it says parents and caregivers. So there's not a lot of parent-children separation still going on at the border, but there's plenty of caregiver-children separations happening. So we work on the Mexican side to try to advocate in the cases of non-traditional family units or caregiver relationships to try to maintain their unity as they go through the process, getting them the appropriate documentation from Central America or from Mexico. Unfortunately, we've basically been wholly unsuccessful in that. That is, as prepared as somebody is presenting at the port of entry with this documentation accrediting that they really are the legal guardians of the children, they're still being separated and the children are still being sent to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. We've also worked with some families who have split up because of Title 42, where they've crossed together, and then when they were expelled to Mexico, sent their children across by themselves because they knew that their children at least could be safe, even if the parents then ended up not continuing to be stranded in Mexico. And so we've helped those parents when they arrive to us in that situation navigate the Office of Refugee Resettlement process, which there's various complexities, like you can't dial a 1-800 number from Mexico. And ORR still hasn't fully resolved that issue of how do you even make the call from the Mexican side of the border unless I hand them a US cell phone. But we try to help parents navigate that system so that they can at least find where their kids are. And then the Florence project, which provides legal services here in Nogales and just does an extraordinary job in the US in detention and in the ORR shelters, is doing much more of that work of identifying specific cases.
Yeah, I'll just say that we have, mainly been involved in advocacy along the way, as many others I'm sure on this call have been. And then in the direct operational work that we do, we're working in detention centers that are strictly adults, so none of the children are there. And then most of the work with shelters and mental health and psychosocial support at the El Paso Juarez border right now is in Juarez, in the shelters there. So there are situations where people, for all the reasons Joanna mentioned and various reasons, families have been separated. And so we're trying to provide support for them, although more on the mental health and psychosocial support, which of course that's a very traumatic experience for people, parents to go through, children to go through. Our legal support work, which is limited, we just don't have much staff at this point. And so that's more on helping people get through the process, know your rights, those kinds of things, make sure they can successfully get across and get through the asylum process. And so we have not been dealing with the legal side of the family separation.
You guys haven't done any work with in terms of supporting those children who have been separating their families. But we've tried to, as Joan said, advocate for the reunification of those families. And we've also worked on trying to highlight that in the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, there's actually language in that bill that would try to work on reunifying families and children, but also reunifying families who have been separated from deportation in the U.S. Not a lot of folks, I think, when we think of separation of kids, I think everyone always just thinks at the border, and they should, but we also forget that there are U.S.-born citizen children who are separated from their families every day, and then are forced in some cases to foster homes. We have worked with a lot of students actually who have also had family members separated while they're in college, while they're in their school, and have worked with them in supporting them through actually to helping them share their stories and how that has helped them empower them and healing themselves from all the hardship of being separated from their parents and their families.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you. We are coming up to our last few minutes before we move into the examen. And so I was hoping that we could ask each of you all to take about a minute or a minute and a half for some kind of final thoughts or comments that we can leave with our audience before we move into the examen. So Jose, could I start with you and just ask for any thoughts or comments you'd want to leave, and then go to Joan and Joanna?
Jennifer, it's Andrea. Can I chime in really fast?
Oh,
Jose,
absolutely. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay, Jose. I'll give you a minute to think of your final comments. Just to add to the panelists a few other thoughts that have come in. Two professor colleagues, Genevieve, asked, we've heard a lot about student organizations and student advocacy. What could a classroom, or what can a classroom or a faculty meeting look like for advocacy work? I think that would be really powerful if you could bring that into some comments. And then Andrew Moore just had a question here about, I'll read it here. President Biden's US Citizenship Act has a section on addressing the root causes of migration. However, at the same time, the Biden administration is sending a message to migrants to not come and to stay home. So what, do you have any reflections there? And then Joanna, there was just a question about the numbers of folks that you are experiencing crossing the border. So if that's something you could add to your comments too. Sorry to jump in. Thank you.
Totally fine. Thank you for monitoring all of that and grabbing all of those together. So yes, so final comments with those put in. Jose, and then Joan and Joanna.
I think having opportunities in the classroom to have these conversations, to have these moments of encounter, is one of the most important things about a Jesuit education. I actually felt like I never had any of that in my time at Xavier. I had all those moments of encounter, even though myself, I was a DACA recipient. I had those moments of encounters outside of the classroom. And that has really helped and shaped me in the advocate I am, continue to do the work in faith-based organizing. So I think allowing for these conversations to happen, encouraging those moments of encounters, and as I mentioned before, having those conversations with student organizers that really bring these radical ideas to campus about how to make your campus a more welcoming place. Even though they might be hard, they might be uncomfortable, it doesn't mean that you should dismiss them right away. And a lot of the students actually understand, and we talk about that this work of justice, it's a long haul work. It's long, and students are willing to continue supporting one another even after college. And I feel like I still do that every day in my day-to-day work. So also leave a comment on the comment that Vice President Harris said. That goes against, one, as Catholics, that goes against our values. But I also think that goes against everything that the Biden administration campaigned on their issues on migration. I felt it was a very kind of weird lack of communication that was done between themselves, each other, and between the campaign staff and maybe even staffers who continuously are working. And with my own colleagues through different coalitions, the conversations that we are hearing that the Biden administration is quietly having to try to address these root causes.
Okay, so I would close with a couple of things. On the question of faculty and staff, I mean, I think the engagement of faculty and staff in our work is critical on campuses because you guys are there. You're not graduating in 6 months and going somewhere else and whatnot. So in terms of ongoing engagement and really building capacity and playing a role and including advocacy capacity in the districts and states where you're present in things, that engagement is critical. And we really want to work with you on that. And then the leadership you can provide and support to students as they kind of come and go. So very much supportive of that and would love to work with you because I think there's a really critical role in all these things, in addition to the expertise you bring, that we're doing legal services, we're doing social work essentially. And so there's a whole range of around the world doing, business development for refugees in unique places and things like that. So there's all kinds of expertise that you can bring. So we would love to explore that more than we can in this setting. On the question of the vice president's statement, I think, I mean, we just have to be clear that the US is the kind of country that allows people to come here seeking refuge when they are in danger. And we can't have a message that says, don't come, or we will not provide you refuge if you have a legitimate need. So that I think we have to message that in a way that really reminds people of the roots of this, which is that when people's lives are at risk, we are a source of refuge and hope, and that's the kind of country we are. And then the one other thing I would want to say is, boy, now is the time to get involved. And I say that for so many, I mean, really more, I mean, we know that in this administration, the possibilities for policy changes are greater than they were in the last administration, and we better seize them now and build the massive support in the country that can ensure that those policy changes, whether it's rebuilding the resettlement program, which was gutted, reestablishing asylum and the US commitment to it, fixing our labor migration laws so that people actually have more opportunities to come and meet our labor needs and also their desire to work. But there's just so many policy areas where we can all work together, and we can't let this moment pass us by. And there's also going to be a huge need for operational support for people coming into the country, whether through the resettlement program or through the asylum program at our borders and things. So now's the time for all of us to get involved, and we hope that we can all work together to do that. And a little bit of the really immediate now is the time. June 20th is World Refugee Day. I think it may have been in the chat. I couldn't see it. And so just know that that is a time when there'll be a lot of attention. It's a good time to lift this up. We are going to have an event tomorrow. You can go to our website if you want to find out more about it. To mark World Refugee Day, and it includes kind of lifting up the strengths and resilience and amazingness of so many refugees, including refugee athletes and things like that. And the UN will be releasing its new data on displacement around the world. That chart that I had in my presentation will be updated, and I think it's probably likely that the numbers will go up. If we're lucky, they will go down, but that's something to kind of stay tuned, because it will be another moment to reach out to people, let them know what's going on when it comes to forcibly displaced people.
Great, thanks, Joanna. 2 minutes.
Speaking of World Refugee Day, we also have an event June 21st. The Bishop of Tucson is going to host us in the cathedral with talking about how Tucson and Arizona are communities of welcome. So stay tuned for that. I think I can't answer all of these questions in 2 minutes, but so what I will say is, Jessica, you can follow up with me directly with those questions and I'll answer them offline. And from an institutional perspective, we need to be thinking student activism is really important, and faculty also have a role when it comes to research, when it comes to coursework, the decisions you're making about what you teach. If you want to think about how to leverage research for change, I think that Genevieve is really the best person to talk to here. And we've been really excited by the collaboration that we've been able, we at KBI have had with Genevieve around research and curriculum material and other questions. One thing that was particularly inspiring for me that I'd encourage other campuses to think about is Fordham University, after doing a couple of after some faculty visited KBI under the ICP program, they followed up by really doing an institutional audit of what are we already doing when it comes to migration, and then what are some of the other tools or resources or connections that we can leverage as an institution. And I think it's that level of work that faculty have a lot of influence over. Maybe it's not starting another 10 programs, but it's at least thinking what already exists, and then how can we network and leverage it more effectively, either for awareness raising or for change. An example of that would be Georgetown University has a press, and they are publishing, and this is going to be out July 1st, a book, Voices of the Border, that's testimonies of migrants in Nogales that Sister Ingracia, who's on our staff, has been collecting for years and years. It's a beautiful book in English and Spanish. The testimonies are in English and their original language, which most of that is Spanish. And we're going to have a series of book release events. So that's one very concrete example, but think about what kinds of access to power and resources does your institution have, and how can you leverage that effectively? More than happy to connect offline with questions or ideas, or if you're interested in partnering with KBI on these opportunities.
Great. Thank each of you so much, each of our panelists, and for the comments and questions and resources that have been in the chat. I'm sure there will be lots of opportunities and interest in follow-up and continued conversation, which is one of the great benefits of our conference, is the connecting with each other and the leveraging of new ideas. Let me turn over now to Chris Kerr to lead us in the final part of our meeting this afternoon.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. And before I begin, I just want to say thanks to Joan and to Joanna and Jose, who are three wonderful colleagues who we get the chance to work together all the time on different projects and initiatives. And Jose has to put up with me every day, but Joan and Joanna don't get away from me that much either. So just really grateful for your work in the Ignatian family and work for the larger church, and for your contributions today. So thank you for that. Before we pause to reflect and pray utilizing the Examen, I wanted to make sure I acknowledge that in this space, we each come into it with unique stories of how migration has impacted our lives and those of our family and our ancestors as well. For some of us, a migration journey has had a recent impact on our lives. For others, our own or those of our family members' stories might seem like a long time ago, their migration stories. And for some, the stories are filled with joy and triumph. And for others, their migration stories might be filled with loss and with pain. We also acknowledge that on our continent, the reality of migration has created great opportunity for some, and for others, great suffering. So we just try to acknowledge that each of us has a unique story that we bring to this space. And also with all this in mind, I invite you to enter into this space with an openness to a vision of a world that is seen less like a lifeboat where some are thrown off to welcome others, and seen more like a banquet table where radical hospitality welcomes all those who approach. So let us take a moment to calm ourselves and to recognize the presence of God all around us. And we'll begin by giving thanks to God for creation and for being wonderfully made, and for the gift of the diversity of people and cultures spread across the earth. Let's take a minute to reflect on the following question. In my daily life, where do I appreciate God's presence in the diversity of cultural perspectives and experiences that are different from my own? And now, let us ask God for the grace to see human migration and all of creation as God does, in all its splendor and in its sufferings. Recognizing our own dreams and desire to live a fulfilling life, we bring to mind our neighbors across the world with those same desires for themselves and their families. Let's take a moment to reflect on the following question. In my words, thoughts, and deeds, how do I recognize the dignity and rights of those who migrate as they journey to find a safe and stable place to explore their vocation, to flourish, and to be most fully human. Now let us ask God for the grace to open our hearts to some of the emotions of those who migrate across the world, emotions they may experience. So I'd like you to take a moment to let the following emotions wash over yourself. Desolation of leaving a place of origin, of leaving a home, of leaving a dream for a future that will not come to fruition as envisioned. Fear of traveling to a new place with new customs or language. Uncertainty in trusting strangers for safe transport and support. Loss and pain. Loss and pain at the separation from loved ones by accident or across borders. Exhaustion from a long, arduous journey. Relief in the actions of a kind stranger or at receiving a warm meal. Joy at being reunited with family and friends. Longing for the beauty and love left behind in one's home country. I invite you just to linger with one of those emotions, whichever one captured your imagination. Now let us ask God for the grace to reconcile our relationship with God and humanity, and to stand in solidarity through our actions. Take a moment to reflect on these questions. Where have I fallen short in caring for my neighbors on their migration journeys? Have I been a beacon of hospitality, or have I hardened my heart to their stories or ignored them completely? We ask for conversion of heart to move past our own sense of borders in order to care deeply about the stories of those who migrate and take action in our communities, on our campuses, through acts of accompaniment service, and advocacy. And now let us end our examen with this closing prayer. God, source of all light, we are surrounded by the darkness of injustice experienced by your people. We pray today, especially for those in our world forced to migrate. Let your light shine through our efforts to be people of encounter who seek to know, love, and walk with those who migrate. Let your light shine as we build spaces of radical hospitality where people can flourish and be most fully human. Let your light shine by instilling in us the courage to not let borders on a map limit our understanding of neighbor. Let your light shine. Amen.
Thank you so much, Chris Kerr, for that beautiful and inspiring reflection. I've already gotten requests in the chat for you to share that with us. And I'd like to remind everyone who was inspired and moved by this incredible discussion to follow our panel today that the videos are available kind of in perpetuity, and that you can feel free to share these with people in your network so that we can continue to bring light, shine light on the importance of this issue of migration. I'd like to thank you again, each of you, for joining us today, and thank our panelists, Professor Jennifer Willard of Georgetown, Professor Genevieve Negron Gonzalez of the University of San Francisco, Jose Arnulfo Cabrera, Director of Education and Advocacy for Migration at the Ignatian Solidarity Network, Joan Rosenhauer, Executive Director of Jesuit Refugee Service, and Joanna Williams, Executive Director of the Kino Border Institute. I'd also really like to thank our captioner for today, Marie Fresh, and for Dave Opitz, who has made all of these videos magically work for us. I remind you that this conference continues next week on Tuesday and Thursday. On Tuesday, we will have a wonderful panel on women in leadership in Jesuit higher education, organized by our steering committee member and birthday girl, Erica Kirby, who's celebrating a milestone birthday today. So happy birthday to Erica. And this panel will begin with Dr. Margot Haidt of Xavier University, who will provide context on the 14th decree of Jesuits and the situation of women in church and civil society. She'll be followed by 3 women leaders, President Tanya Tetlow of my own university, Loyola University, New Orleans. She's a wonderful speaker. The Vice President of Student Affairs at Holy Cross, Dr. Michelle Murray, who I'm sure is a wonderful speaker as well, and the AJCU Vice President for Mission Integration, the amazing Stephanie Russell. This will be followed with a live Q&A at 3:30 Eastern Daylight Time that will feature all the participants and will be moderated by Patricia Grant of Georgetown University. June Ellis, professor at Loyola University, Maryland, will lead the examen. So I know everyone has a lot to think about and is tired, so I wish you a fruitful afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And thank you all so much. And let's remember the wonderful words in this that were shared with us by Joanna Williams. What would it look like if we really worked for the greater glory of God? So thank you so much. Bye-bye.